It's Wednesday, March 26, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today on the show, is it Signalgate or Signal Scandal or Signal Ghazi? Whatever. Either way, this big story this week in politics is about a group chat between some of the highest national security, defense, and intelligence officials in the United States and how a journalist was accidentally added to that thread. So, if you're just catching up on this story, on March 15th, the U.S. launched airstrikes on a designated terror group known as the Houthis in Yemen. You don't need to know a ton about the group, but what you should know is that they're backed by Iran, and for years on and off, they have been attacking shipping lanes and American ships in those lanes in the Middle East, specifically in the Suez Canal in Egypt, which is the fastest route between Europe and Asia, and where a considerable amount of global trade has to move through. Now, no one wants a band of rebels with rocket launchers whose motto is death to America, death to Israel, at least in part, to be in control of one of the most important trade choke points on the planet, nor does anybody want ships to be forced to take the long way around, which would jam up supply chains to avoid being attacked. So the U.S. began launching airstrikes on the Houthis because of this. And that's where the group chat comes in. According to the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, he was added to a group chat on the encrypted messaging app Signal by National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. This was strange, Goldberg says, because he's only met Waltz maybe a few times and was randomly added to this group. Now, the chat started to fill up with names of the highest level officials. I am talking about Vice President J.D. Vance, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of the National Counterterrorism Center Joe Kent, who has yet to be confirmed to that position, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and Steve Witkoff, the Special Envoy to the Middle East. I know that was a long list. You don't need to know all of their names. What you do need to know is that Goldberg here is obviously concerned that this group isn't real. It seems extremely strange that he would get added to this group because the name of the group was Houthi PC Small Group, and PC stands for Principals Committee, which means the top decision makers in this group. And then this group started discussing airstrikes. Not in an abstract way, in a real military and political strategy way. Members like Hegseth and Waltz were discussing how and when to begin bombings. People like the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, were talking about intelligence on the ground, including the name of an active CIA officer, which the Atlantic withheld for that person's safety, something the agency director didn't even do, even though it's a felony to release names of an officer. Others like Vance and Miller were talking about the political considerations, the way that Trump was thinking and that they were thinking. So Goldberg is even more concerned and more confused by all this. And then just a few hours later, after he's watched this chat happen without saying anything, he starts to see news reports coming in about airstrikes being carried out in Yemen. And it's here that Goldberg really starts to think that this group might be the real deal, and lo and behold, it is. A spokesperson for the National Security Council, which is a section of the White House, says the chat is authentic, and then from there we are off to the races. So now you're caught up. Let's talk about why this is such a big deal, and I know it feels obvious, but there are layers here worth peeling back that were then made more complicated by the pushback from the White House and other Republicans. So, for starters, Signal is an encrypted messaging app that's used by journalists. I use it. It's used by activists, whistleblowers, people who don't want their discussions to be in regular messages by design, according to the terms of service on Signal. The messages aren't saved or stored, and the app has a feature where messages can disappear after a short amount of time after you read them, kind of like a Mission Impossible thing, except without the smoke and explosions. But the key thing to know here is that despite it being encrypted, it isn't secure. In 2023, the Department of Defense outlined that Signal was considered an unmanaged messaging app, not unlike iMessage on an iPhone or WhatsApp, and it wasn't cleared for classified, sensitive, or even unclassified but still not public information or communication. And then just a month ago, the Pentagon sent out a notice saying Signal wasn't safe or secure and that Russian hackers were using devices to hack into Signal conversations. And that right there, both of those things are alarming because everyone in this group chat, maybe apart from Jeffrey Goldberg, would have gotten this security alert about the Russian hackers. They would have known about which apps they can and can't use because they've had top-level training on how to handle classified information. And then they still felt it was okay to use Signal to have this discussion. But it also turns out there's another layer to this because Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy for the U.S., was in Moscow when he was added to and involved in the group chat, likely using cell towers and internet connection on public Russian servers. And I want to say here, too, that Witkoff says he did not have his personal phone with him during his trip, so his involvement in the chat wasn't a risk while he was in Russia, which doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense here because he was responding to these messages. And it only makes sense if a couple things are true, but it raises some questions on those things because first, Signal isn't supposed to be able to be downloaded to government phones. So either Witkoff is lying about not having his personal phone, or there's a lapse in the IT department at the White House because Signal is on government phones. Only one of those things can be true. And if Witkoff is lying here, he's admitting to at least him, but likely other government officials, using their personal phones for highly sensitive official communication and work, which they're not supposed to do. I'm not going to do the hypocrisy thing in full here, but these are a lot of people who were very upset about Hillary Clinton using a private email server in 2016. Almost everybody in this group chat had something to say about that. And then on top of this Signal conversation, it potentially violates the Espionage Act for releasing sensitive information on a public forum, but that's not what the White House nor people in this group are saying about this story. They all maintain that this discussion was perfectly fine and no classified information or war plans or attack plans were shared. Here's how Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth put it to reporters.
You're talking about a deceitful and highly discredited so-called journalist who's made a profession of peddling hoaxes time and time again, to include the hoaxes of Russia, or the fine people on both sides hoax, or suckers and losers hoax. So this is the guy that peddles in garbage. This is what he does. I've heard I was characterized. Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
Nobody was texting war plans. Hold on to that thought. Now, I also want to say that I don't know Jeffrey Goldberg personally. We've never met or talked, but he does have a reputation for being one of the most principled journalists in the country, especially on national security, which he's covered for decades. But let's move on here because the timing of this also coincidentally lined up with a Senate hearing where the directors of the FBI, CIA, and National Intelligence were set to appear in front of the Senate to give updates on what they were doing. A hearing that was on the books already before this story broke and before these strikes. In the hearing, Democratic senators grilled these officials over this group chat. CIA Director Ratcliffe repeatedly said no classified information was talked about and no war plans were talked about, but didn't show any remorse that this happened at all. Here's the exchange he had with Georgia Senator John Ossoff.
Director Ratcliffe, this was a huge mistake, correct?
No.
A national political...
Hold on.
No, you
Let me
hold
answer.
on. No, Director Ratcliffe, I asked you a yes or no question, and now you'll hold on. a national political reporter
You can characterize it how you want.
was made privy
The White
to
House has
sensitive
made
information
clear
about
that there
imminent
was an
military
inadvertent
operations against a
mistake,
foreign terrorist
an inadvertent
organization.
mistake of adding a reporter.
And that wasn't a huge
to
mistake?
Israel.
That wasn't a huge mistake?
Well, I think they characterize
This is
it
an
as a
embarrassment.
mistake.
This is utterly unprofessional. There's been no apology. There has been no recognition of the gravity of this error. And by the way, we will get the full transcript of this chain, and your testimony will be measured carefully against its content. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the witnesses again.
Ossoff clearly angered there, and this was near the end of the hearing, actually, after Ratcliffe and the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, had been ducking questions and giving some pretty evasive answers for several hours at that point. Here's how Gabbard, speaking of her, answered Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, who was an astronaut and a naval captain.
Ms. Gabbard, does the intelligence community have a policy that prohibits discussion of controlled, unclassified information?
Yes.
It does. Okay. Controlled, unclassified information, according to DOD, includes information that is information that has not been approved for public release. Would you, of what's been disclosed publicly of the signal chain, would either of you feel that that would be approved for public release? Ms. Gabbard.
The discussion that took place in that Signal chat group was a conversation reflecting national security leaders and the vice president around the president's objectives.
So yes or no, would you approve that for public release?
I don't feel I can answer that question here.
Because of the nature of this hearing?
Because of the nature of a private discussion that took place between individual leaders in our government.
So Gabbard isn't alone in this, but she wants to have it both ways in this answer here, that everything in the chat was fine and above board, but she can't talk about it in a public forum because it's sensitive. And I also want to note here, too, that a lot of Republican members on this committee said they also had concerns about this chat, but wanted to talk about these things behind closed doors instead, which, again, a little bit having it both ways. If the chat was fine and you believe the members in front of you, there's no reason to have this behind closed doors unless there's a reason to do that because something in the chat wasn't fine. You get what I'm saying. Also, you might notice a guy sitting next to Tulsi Gabbard if you're watching this. That is FBI Director Kash Patel, who was probably pretty glad that he wasn't the direct ire of this entire committee, but he refused to say whether he would be launching an investigation into how a journalist got into this group chat in the first place when he was asked about it. So he wasn't entirely blameless, but he did kind of catch a stray there. And then as this was going on, the White House was also doing damage control as well, also wanting it both ways. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said repeatedly that no classified material was released, no war plans were discussed, and she tried to discredit Goldberg while also saying the White House would be looking into the leak. Again, having it both ways. Either this was not an issue, or it is and needs to be investigated. And it also got all the way to President Donald Trump, who, when he was asked about this chat, at the time said he had no idea what anybody was talking about. Also something we'll come back to a little later. Finally, yesterday, we heard from Mike Waltz on Fox News, who had this to say about the chat.
He hates the president, but I don't text him. He wasn't on my phone, and we're going to figure out how this happened.
So you don't know what staffer is responsible for this right now?
Well, look, a staffer wasn't responsible, and look, I take full responsibility. I built the group. My job is to make sure everything's coordinated.
But how did the number?
I
mean, I don't mean to be pedantic here, but how did the number?
Have you ever had somebody's contact that shows their name, and then you have somebody else's number there?
I never make those mistakes.
Right? You got somebody else's number on someone else's contact. So of course I didn't see this loser in the group. It looked like someone else. Now, whether he did it deliberately or it happened in some other technical mean is something we're trying to figure out.
So Walls here leaving the door open that he could have somehow been duped by Goldberg into inviting him unprompted, which doesn't really make a ton of sense, but that baton was picked up by Leavitt in the next hour on Fox.
It certainly could have been more mischievous, as Mike Waltz alluded to in the previous hour. We are working very hard to find out how this number was inadvertently added to the group chat. It remains a mystery, but we hope.
So, again, it remains a mystery, but it also was inadvertent, so not that big of a deal, but it could also have been nefarious. But don't worry, nothing was wrong with the chat, but it's worth investigating what was in it, who was in it, though nothing in it mattered. I don't know. And on top of all of that, up on Capitol Hill, members of Congress are approaching this in a few ways, we'll say, to be generous. Democrats, angry, calling for resignations. They want full investigations. Many of them are saying they can't believe that this is happening. Republicans, on the other hand, aren't rushing to defend the chat, but here's what several members said.
I'm not a technology expert, and I don't know all the details, but somebody made a mistake. And that happens. I think most Americans understand that.
It's not the first time that members of press have been on meetings or chats before, but obviously that was not that was a problem.
So just a big mix-up, a mistake. It happens. Who among us hasn't accidentally released plans for an attack on a foreign country or discussed internal political strategy with a journalist we didn't know was there? But there were also others, like Nebraska Representative Don Bacon, who raised his own concerns, but those folks were far and few between.
99.99% with confidence, Russia and China are monitoring those two phones. So I just think it's a security violation, and there's no doubt that Russia and China saw this stuff, within hours of the actual attacks on Yemen or the Houthis. So that's wrong.
And finally, for Congress, here's how Republican Speaker of the House Mike Johnson put it in a press conference yesterday.
Well, look, the White House came out with a statement, I think within the last hour. Somebody handed me what they said. They clarified there were no war plans discussed. There was no classified material sent on that thread. The White House counsel is looking into the matter, looking into how this other number was inadvertently added. Obviously, that was a mistake and a serious one. But I just want to say, thanks to President Trump and his strong leadership and all the everybody on that group chat, the leaders on that group chat are extraordinary people. I know them all personally. They're patriots. They're doing a great job for the country. And that was a successful mission. We're taking out Houthi terrorists. That's what the American people expect the administration to do, to restore peace through strength and to act decisively. So, look, they've acknowledged that there was an error and they're correcting it. And I would have asked the same thing of the Biden administration. I don't think anyone should have lost their job over that because an errant number, found its way onto a dialogue between leaders. It's a mistake, but we got to correct it going forward, and they will.
So Johnson actually brings up a good point here. And I want you to think about this as we keep going, because this is one of those times when if you're watching all of this play out and you agree with what's happening or what's being said, it's important to ask yourself what you would do, how you would feel, what you would demand from our leaders if a different party were in the White House. And I don't mean that only if you're a Trump supporter. If the shoe were on the other foot, I think despite what Johnson said, we'd see a lot more outrage from Republicans in Congress. Articles of impeachment would likely be drafted for the vice president. Mass calls for resignations would be happening on both sides of the aisle, especially if someone like Biden were in office. And if those people weren't made to resign, then Republicans who are in control of the House would likely begin drafting articles of impeachment for the president. At the very least, most people would like to see a degree of seriousness from their leaders about how this happened, even if they think that what was in the chat is not classified or even all that sensitive. It's certainly embarrassing and concerning that no one in the group caught that a person who wasn't supposed to be there was there. And I think no matter which side of the aisle you're actually on, that's something we can all agree on. So keep that in mind, as everyone in the White House is saying nothing was wrong with the chat, Waltz admitting that it was a mistake, but everything was fine, and then members of Congress downplaying it, all of it basically daring The Atlantic to release the entire text chain. And today, they did. And boy, do things look bad. So the entire chain, except for at least one name that we do know about, of a CIA officer was released. in this text chain, there are specific plans released by Pete Hegseth and Mike Waltz about when, where, and how strikes would take place. We got a deeper insight as well into the political thinking behind the strike, something we got a little bit of in the original story, J.D. Vance breaking with the president, saying the strikes were a mistake because in his mind, it meant bailing out Europe from taking care of the Houthi problem in the Suez Canal, and Hegseth agreeing with him, along with Stephen Miller, who jumped in at one point to say he thought the strikes were what Trump wanted. But obviously the important part were the actual attack plans. Hegseth saying at one point, time now, 11:44, weather is favorable, just confirmed with CENTCOM, Central Command, we are a go for mission launch. And then he laid out the mission, saying F-18 fighter jets would launch at 12:15, with the first bombing package happening an hour and a half later. That also included drone strikes. And then a second round of airstrikes would launch shortly after that, followed by more drones and Tomahawk missiles. Ironically, adding at the end of this text chain, clean on OPSEC, meaning operational security was clean, there were no leaks, a message he typed into a group chat with an accidental member without security clearance, on an app the government doesn't consider safe or secure, and that his own department put a warning out for about Russian hackers just a few weeks before. Waltz also relayed information about seeing a target meet with his girlfriend, knowing the apartment building, saying they had multiple positive IDs for the Houthis' top missile guy, and that the building that guy went into collapsed on top of him after the strikes. All of that information can only be found out and only acknowledges that the U.S. has some kind of covert operation either honed in on the area from something like a satellite or potentially real people on the ground. And it's also important to say, and it's something that The Atlantic noted too, that when these texts were sent, if they had leaked beyond Goldberg or if foreign adversaries had been listening, which they still could have been, we don't know, it might have given the Houthis time to hide or escape if they had gotten their hands on that information. Well, the release of the text chain set off an entirely new round of pushback from the White House. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt saying on Twitter or X or whatever today that The Atlantic has conceded these were not war plans. This entire story was another hoax written by a Trump hater who was well known for his sensationalist spin. However, in the Atlantic article about the release of the text chain that had the entire thing in it, she said this: this was intended to be an internal and private deliberation amongst high-level senior staff, and sensitive information was discussed. For those reasons, yes, we object to the release. Again, wanting to have it both ways. J.D. Vance also said online about the text chain release, it's very clear Goldberg oversold what he had. The one thing in particular really stands out. Remember when he was attacking Ratcliffe for blowing the cover for a CIA agent? Turns out Ratcliffe was simply naming his chief of staff. Here, it's worth pointing out that Vance would absolutely know that the CIA director's chief of staff is considered an active CIA officer, and that disclosing that person's name in anything that's not secure is a felony. Mike Waltz also jumping in on social media on top of those two, saying no locations, no sources and methods, no war plans, seeming to completely ignore that sources and methods like planes, timing, and strike packages were all discussed. But this seems to be the line that they'll be sticking to going forward. Now, I looked at the classification system that's laid out by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, what the government uses to define what information is considered classified. And a quick rundown here, I've talked about this before, but just a refresher, classified documents are broken into three groups: classified, secret, and top secret. There are a couple smaller levels at the very top of that chain and the very bottom that include things like public records, but what is important is that under the government's own classification, things like strategic policy planning, so think about what J.D. Vance said about Donald Trump and this mistake. Well, depending on the level of specificity, it could be confidential, secret, or even top secret. Things like general information about military plans, specific information about military plans, intentions, capabilities, or activities, and even the indication that the U.S. was planning an attack were all considered either confidential, secret, or top secret in that order. And on a plain reading of these standards, discussing planes, timing, bombing locations, the weather would all seem to fall under these definitions. A former spokesperson for the Pentagon, Chris Mager, said online this would absolutely have been classified information when Pete Hegseth sent it to the chain, and absolutely would potentially be putting the men and women in those F-18s in harm's way. Now, there has been some talk that maybe Hegseth declassified the information prior to or during the time the group chat was happening, or maybe just afterwards so that everyone could say that nothing was classified in the conversation. But he refused to tell reporters about that when he was asked. And then today, CNN confirmed that the information was still a secret, with sources telling them the information Secretary of Defense Hegseth disclosed in the Signal chat was classified at the time he wrote it, especially because the operation had not even started yet, with one source adding, "It's safe to say that anybody in uniform would be court-martialed for this, and my most junior analyst knows not to do this." So all of this is a scandal, and in any other administration, heads would roll. People would lose their jobs. There'd be extensive investigations into who did what and when and why exactly Goldberg was added to this chat, which he also left voluntarily, by the way. But beyond the scandal here, there are three things that stick out to me that are also concerns that are bigger than this story. The first is something I wrote about on the Make It Make Sense Substack the day the story first dropped. This extremely relaxed approach to government secrets is a pattern that we've come to understand from a Trump presidency. In 2017, Trump revealed highly classified information to a Russian ambassador. In 2019, he tweeted out an image that was almost certainly from a classified satellite of an accident at an Iranian space facility. In 2021, the thing that we also all remember, he took classified documents while he was on his way out of office and then refused to give them up while storing them in a bathroom, a ballroom, unsecure spots around Mar-a-Lago, which is a public club. And then there are the concerns about members of his cabinet like Hegseth, whose history of alcohol abuse, his past alleged financial issues, his past allegations for how he treats women were all raised as things that could make him a potential target for foreign adversaries, not to mention his turnabout on a specific alignment with Russia when it comes to Ukraine. The same thing there goes for Tulsi Gabbard, who has long been someone who has repeated Kremlin talking points, who has met with dictators on unofficial visits, and even J.D. Vance, who has become increasingly pro-Russia when it comes to Ukraine, meaning those things could potentially put them in a position where they could be leveraged by foreign adversaries. But none of those concerns have stopped them from getting their jobs they have now. Now, the second part that stuck out to me was the combination of how little Chief of Staff Susie Wiles said in this conversation, along with what Stephen Miller said, the Deputy Chief of Staff. Because what Miller eventually said, and I want to be very specific here, which was, as I heard it, the president was clear, green light. Going on to talk a little bit more about the airstrikes, it's not uncommon for a president to not be in every single discussion that happens in the White House. There's just not enough time in the day. But for Miller to say it like it was a rumor and not a directive was weird. And it's even weirder that the actual chief of staff didn't jump in here to say directly what the president's orders were, what his vision was, and what he was thinking. Those are conversations chiefs of staff have with their presidents, so that the chiefs of staff can then relay those things directly to groups just like this. And then there was the thing that I've talked about a couple times now, that J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth broke with Trump, calling the strikes a mistake and implying that Trump wasn't actually far enough to the right on policy for what they wanted. And again, well, it's not uncommon to have policy disagreements, especially at this level. For no one in the chat there to represent Trump to step in and make it clear, again, what he wanted, shows a level of at least disorganization, or, and this is from the New York Times' Jamel Bowie, that Trump is pretty checked out. But at the very least, it's striking to not have a clear presidential directive in a high-level conversation about the use of military force. And finally, and I'm not going to linger on this because my guest on Friday is going to be all about this, the use of the Signal app, the way that they were talking on this app, the fact that no one caught Goldberg on this app means they were looking at it very carefully, which implies that they do this fairly frequently. And it shows an unwillingness then to comply with records-keeping laws. Again, another pattern that we've come to know from a Trump presidency, and also something, again, I wrote on the Substack. Now, we know that Trump has long been someone who dislikes record-keeping. He tore up official documents into little pieces and then threw them in the trash during his first term, which then made staffers tape them back together with Scotch tape so they could hand them over to the National Archives. Reportedly, staffers would find crumpled up, partially flushed official documents in toilets around the White House. And then, of course, there's the Mar-a-Lago documents case where Trump refused to give back presidential records that the National Archives said didn't belong to him. I also need to say here that a judge dismissed that case against him, and he still has those documents. And then on top of that, in the first Trump administration, one of Trump's top advisors, Steve Bannon, said he was trying to make sure there was no paper trail from the White House, including using apps like Signal and Signal itself. And back then, when the White House was sued over this, a judge dismissed that case for other legal reasons, but said using Signal ran afoul of the law. And then even in this administration, there's been a lot of movement to get rid of people like the National Archivist and the people who fulfill freedom of information requests from the public for public documents, or to remove agencies like DOJ from being subject to those public laws, and also removing agencies and people like Elon Musk or DOJ from being subject to those information laws, making much of what the most sweeping things this administration has been doing secret for 5 years after Trump leaves office. So this instance of using Signal could seem to suggest that high-level officials are hoping to avoid creating a record of their own thinking, planning, and actions once again. So what happens now? Well, there will certainly be more fallout. There was another hearing today with those same intelligence officials. It happened while I was writing and recording, so I didn't get a chance to watch it. I'll watch it tonight because what else are you going to do on a Wednesday night? And then there is also a lawsuit that was just filed by the same group from the first Trump term that has just been filed in a D.C. court and just assigned a judge, so we will wait for that to play out. But that's pretty much it, which means that is all for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new videos. Subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack so you can go back and see those 2 other articles that I wrote about this piece the last 2 days. I'll have some more coming this week, likely about this same thing as well. And if you don't want to do that, even though it's just $5 a month, please continue to share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you on Friday.